Hello everyone. I apologize for the delay of the video. I had some trouble over the past couple of days, but I'm not going to delay you any longer. I'm going to go ahead and start with the lecture for the male and female reproductive system as well as the respiratory system. First, before I really get started, I'm coming to you live from my home, so I like to give a disclaimer just in case anything comes up, like dogs barking, kids coming in the door, husband walking by. So just don't be alarmed. I'll try to just continue to go through it. Right now I'm at home by myself, so hopefully, well, other than the dog, which I'm certain you can hear walking around. But other than that, I should be able to get through the lecture without too much of a problem. So my suggestion is that you have the PowerPoint presentation. If you don't have it printed off, you can go ahead and pause this, print it off. I would also suggest taking notes on the lecture that I am presenting. If you print it off, the PowerPoint presentations off, and you make notes on that, that's fine, but I would suggest putting it on a separate sheet of paper or in your anatomy notebook. Just in the event I decide to let you use some type of notes or something on the quiz. I haven't quite made up my mind on that, but you will need to take notes on this video lecture, so hopefully that will be helpful to you. Okay, so I'm going to start with the male and female reproductive system. If you see me looking over to the right, or it might look like you're left, I'm actually looking at the PowerPoint presentation as I have it up on my computer. Okay, first things first, what you need to know in regard to the male and female reproductive systems are the various functions. And in the first slide of the PowerPoint presentation, it identifies those functions. Our reproductive systems are responsible for maintaining gametes, producing gametes, transporting them, the maintenance of the zygote, which is the fertilized egg, and then the production of the male and the female hormones. A couple of things that I want to make sure that you understand. First, the word gametes. Gametes. Gametes are actually sex cells. So, let me back up some. The sex cells include the following. In males, sperm, and in females, ovum, or ova would be plural, and that's just the egg. No star, dog getting ready to bark. So when we talk about the production of the gametes, spermatogenesis is the division of the sex cells in the male. So we talked about division of normal body cells way back in I believe it was chapter 3, where we talked about mitosis. And at that time, I indicated to you that the gametes, or the sex cells, actually underwent another process. Cellular division in the sex cells is called meiosis. But it's different in both the male and the female. Meiosis is just, or meiosis, either way, is the division of the sex cells. Now, at the end of mitosis, please recall the stages of mitosis, which were prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase. At the end, we had the end product was the two cells that were called daughter cells because they were identical to the parent. So if the parent cell started with a pair of chromosomes, then after mitosis, the end product were two cells that were identical to the parent. Well, that's not the case in meiosis. In meiosis, the end product, let me just indicate this is mitosis. The end product, meiosis, is different. You will note that instead of having the same number of chromosomes as the original parent cell, they actually have half the number of chromosomes. So in this case, we call this number diploid, which means twice the number. The end product is haploid. This way, which is just half the number. So the end product of spermatogenesis and oogenesis, because spermatogenesis is in the male, oogenesis is in the female, it's half the number of chromosomes. So what does that mean? That means during the stages of meiosis, not only do the cells divide once, but they divide twice. The end product of spermatogenesis, which is the form of meiosis in the male, the end product of spermatogenesis results in 4 sperm cells, or spermatozoa. You might see it in the textbook, or spermatids, same thing. So that would be the end product. However, the end product of oogenesis would be one very large ovum and 3 very small polar bodies. Now these polar bodies, because the egg is so very large, they are not viable. They don't live. So what ends up happening is they actually disintegrate. But the end product of oogenesis, the one large egg and the 3 smaller polar bodies, which end up disintegrating. Okay, so that's an overview of the differences between mitosis and meiosis, and then the 2 forms of meiosis being either spermatogenesis in the male and oogenesis in the female. Spermatogenesis, genesis meaning the beginning of, and it's actually the beginning of the production of sperm cells, while oogenesis is the beginning of the production of an egg. Okay, so back to the different functions. Producing the gametes, transporting them throughout the reproductive system, maintaining them to make sure that they're viable, the maintenance and the development of the zygote. The zygote is the fertilized egg, and that only occurs in females. And then the production of the hormones. Now, the predominant hormone in males is testosterone, but that doesn't mean that men don't have progesterone or estrogen, because they do. Same thing for the women. We do have a certain amount of testosterone as well. But the predominant hormones in women would be progesterone and estrogen. All right, let's continue on. In the next slide on the PowerPoint presentation, you will see the various reproductive organs that we are going to identify and talk about their functions. And we're just going to jump right into it. So we'll start with the male reproductive system. The testes. The testes are actually located in the scrotum sac, which is outside of, it's external on the outside of the body. But they are located inside, and they're very small, ovoid or oval-shaped structures, and they are responsible for producing the male sex hormone, the male hormone testosterone, as well as sperm are produced inside of the testes. So their function, the thing about it is if the scrotum sac is on the outside and the testes are located inside, how does that sperm actually get from outside of the body, because that's where it's made, inside the scrotum sac, in order to get back in and be ejaculated through the penis? Well, if you'll look in the textbook, I'm not certain the page, but it identifies the fact that the scrotum sac, actually the portion that comes from the testes the tube actually has to come from the testes and pass back through the peritoneal cavity in order to fuse with the rest of the reproductive system so that it can pass through the urethra. Now remember, the urethra is responsible for the passing urine from the urinary bladder to the outside, but it has dual function because it also allows for semen to pass through and be ejaculated to the outside. So if you look in the PowerPoint presentation, I have a diagram there that I like better just because it gives you an anterior view. The pictures in the text, I believe they all give you a lateral view, but looking at it from an anterior view and having a portion of it actually looking internally as well as looking at it holistically gives you a better idea of where these organs are and their various functions and how they're connected together. The next male reproductive organ that you're going to identify would be vas deferens. Vas deferens are the tools or the spermatic ducts, same thing, that actually travel from the testes. And you'll notice if you look in the PowerPoint presentation, there's a little structure that looks like a little hat sitting on top of the testes. Well, this little hat is called the epididymis. Now, the sperm is actually made in the testes, but just on top of it, that epididymis is responsible for storing sperm when it's not used. So if you can imagine testes, epididymis, and then you've got the tube, the spermatic ducts that actually come from the epididymis. So it allows for the sperm that's made to be stored inside the epididymis, but when it's ready to be ejaculated, it's stored right here and can pass through the spermatic duct. And you'll note in the PowerPoint presentation it says muscular tube which passes upward through the testes, passes through the parietal peritoneum. So that's when it actually goes from the external back internally and into the abdominal cavity. It fuses with the duct from the seminal vesicle to form the ejaculatory duct, which is within the prostate gland. If you look at the next slide, that's where I actually have epididymis. And inside of the epididymis, even though looking at it on the PowerPoint presentation, it just looks like it's a mass sitting on top, in actuality, inside there are several coiled little tubes, and that's where the semen is stored. So you'll note in the PowerPoint presentation, tightly coiled tube leading to vas deferens, and it's the site of storage of the sperm. We've already identified the urethra, which is responsible for allowing for the passage of urine in the urinary system as well as the passage of semen in the reproductive system. And then the prostate gland. The prostate gland, if you've ever seen one, and I don't know that you have, but in pathology, when you take that course, we talk about some of the different types of neoplasms or cancers that occur, and prostate cancer is one that we talk about. The prostate is it's a small gland. It looks kind of like a walnut, and typically prostate cancers are very slow-growing cancers. So if it's identified early enough, oftentimes, more often than not, it's curable. We don't have a cure for cancer, but if it's removed because it is so slow growing, the life expectancy of the individual that had that increases greatly. Okay, but the function of that particular gland is to actually secrete an alkaline fluid that helps with sperm motility. This is what actually helps the sperm be viable and be able to swim. So if the alkalinity of that fluid is off, then it's going to affect the viability of the sperm that are produced. And just to recall, remember, alkaline, as far as the pH scale, is anything that is above 7. Remember, 7 is neutral, 0 is indicating a very strong acid, 7 neutral. Anything from 7 to 14 would be considered alkaline. Okay, and then finally we get to the penis. The penis is the male excitatory organ, and in actuality it also completely surrounds the urethra to allow for excretion of urine or ejaculation of sperm. Now, just a second. No star. Sorry. Okay, now we go to the female reproductive system. The female reproductive system, we have a few more organs that we need to identify and make sure we understand the functions. First things, if you're looking at the PowerPoint presentation, you will note on one side it actually has the cutout. So as if we were to take the uterus out and slice it this way and take the top off this way, we're looking at it internally. And on the other side, you see the completed uterus. So first, we're going to identify the ovaries. The ovaries are located on each side of the uterus, and they are attached by what's called the fallopian tube, and we'll get to its function in a bit. But the ovaries are actually the sites of where the eggs are actually stored inside of the female reproductive system. In addition to that, the ovaries are responsible for producing the female hormones that we identified earlier in the lecture. Now let's continue on, because inside of the ovaries, when a woman is born, she is born with all of the eggs that she will have in her lifetime. And if you look at the PowerPoint presentation, you will note it looks like there are several little eggs that are already inside of the ovary. They are not mature eggs. They are what are called oocytes, and they're primary and they're secondary, and finally one of those will eventually mature to the point that it is released. And if you can look at the presentation, you will notice that at the end, and I think it's actually, yes, it has the word there. It says infundibulum with fimbriae. What fimbriae are, if you see that largest egg on the PowerPoint presentation, it looks like it's getting ready to actually break free through the ovary. Well, the fimbriae, back up a little bit more, kind of sit there. They're kind of like the quarterback, if you can imagine. Now, you've got the guy that hikes the ball. Imagine the egg being the ball, getting ready to be hiked. You've got the quarterback there like this. Fimbriae are actually kind of waiting for that egg to be released, and then they kind of coax it in. They look like little finger-like projections, and they help the egg actually move into the fallopian tube. Because as you can see, it looks like, okay, if the egg were to be released, where would it go? Fimbriae are right there saying, hike me the ball. And they actually coax the egg into the fallopian tube. Which takes us to the next part of the female reproductive system, the fallopian tubes. The fallopian tubes are also called the oviduct or the uterine tubes. They can all be used synonymously. And it's the site of fertilization. That's where the sperm should actually get to meet with the egg to fertilize it. And it becomes the zygote. Doesn't always happen because not all sperm have the ability to get that far, to swim that far. And then once they get there, they can't always penetrate the outer layer of the egg. It doesn't just give up easily. It doesn't say, hey, here I am, I'm just waiting. No, it actually takes some time before the head of the sperm can actually penetrate the egg. But it is the site of fertilization, which is in the fallopian tube. And ideally, what is supposed to happen once the egg has been fertilized, it's supposed to continue to travel through the fallopian tube and then lodge and implant inside of the inner lining of the uterus. If that does not happen and the egg does not continue to travel, but cellular proliferation begins in the fallopian tube, that can create what's called an ectopic pregnancy. Sometimes it's also called a tubular pregnancy, which can risk the life of the mother as well as the fetus. So if that egg is not fertilized, then it will continue to travel through the fallopian tube, and it will eventually pass through the uterus, and it will pass through during the process of menstruation. Okay. Continuing on in the next slide, we have the uterus. The uterus has 3 layers to it. It has the endometrium, which is that inner lining that fertilized egg is supposed to implant into if it's fertilized. If not, it passes and it sloughs off during menstruation. The myometrium is the middle muscular layer. The prefix myo means muscle. And then we have the perimetrium that completely surrounds the entire organ. Just like when we were looking at the stomach and the digestive system, it had a fundus. And remember, the fundus was that ballooning portion of the top of the stomach. The uterus has the same thing. The fundus is the top portion that kind of balloons in this this manner. And then the greater portion of the uterus is called the body. Just like in the stomach, the greatest region, the largest portion, was referred to as the body. So, once again, the uterus has 3 layers. The endometrium is the innermost, the myometrium is the thickest, and it's the muscular layer, and the perimetrium completely surrounds it. The ballooning portion of the uterus is called the fundus, while the greater portion of it is referred to as the body. In addition to that, the lower 1/3 of the uterus is referred to as the cervix. The cervix is actually the lower portion, which we also refer to as the birth canal. The baby actually passes through the cervix and then through the vagina and then out to the outside of the body. So the the cervix is supposed to remain closed during pregnancy. If it begins to dilate or open slightly, then that woman may have to experience being on bed rest, because that zygote, or by this time the fetus, is still continuing to develop. And if that cervix should open, then that could cause preterm labor before the baby is actually born, or it can lead to miscarriage depending on how far into the pregnancy the woman has gone. And then finally, at the end, I don't know if you can see it on the presentation, but at the very, very bottom of the diagram of the uterus, you'll notice that there's a line, but it does not have a word attached to it. That is the vagina. That is the most superior portion of the vagina. And the vagina allows for the vagina is responsible for receiving the erect penis, and that is where the site of ejaculation occurs, and then the sperm must swim upstream in order to meet with the egg, should the egg be present for fertilization. And you will notice that in the presentation it says serves to receive erect penis, to convey uterine secretions, yes, and transport offspring during birth. The final slide is in regard to some of the accessory organs or external organs, like the labia. There's labia minora, labia majora. Labia means lip. So you will note that it says external organs, encloses and protects the underlying tissues and organs of the female reproductive system. The clitoris is the external excitatory organ, because for, I believe it's the first 9 weeks of gestation, we are all anatomically the same, because sexual proliferation and differentiation does not actually come until about the 9th week of pregnancy. So up until that point, we all have the same reproductive organs. Beyond that point, and once cellular proliferation does occur with the reproductive organs, then the clitoris will actually continue to grow to become the penis in the male, but it will stay small in the female at that point. And then the breast and mammary glands are responsible for the production of milk after the baby is born. Okay, so that takes care of the male and female reproductive systems. So we're going to go right into chapter 19, the respiratory system. One of the very important things that you need to understand about the respiratory system is, number one, before I even get into that, we take for granted the ability to be able to breathe. And I never really, you don't think about breathing because it's something that you innately do. You don't have to tell yourself to breathe. Your body just helps you breathe. And I've never had any type of asthma problems. And I'm certain that there are those of you in the class that may have asthma problems, but asthma scares me, and I'm going to tell you why. When I was in mortuary school, the secretary for the department had a 12-year-old daughter at the time. And one weekend, she went to go stay at a sleepover at a girlfriend's house, I guess. But she had asthma. And by Monday, when we came back to school, we found out that Miss Perry had lost her daughter because she was at the sleepover, didn't have her inhaler, they couldn't get to it in time, and she died. So that kind of stuck in my mind for years. I mean, I was a mortuary science student. I couldn't help but think about it. And even though I had never had any type of asthma problems, it just kind of scared me, because oftentimes people don't know they have asthma until they have an asthma attack. Well, fast forward to I guess when my oldest son was about 5 years old, one evening he kept complaining of his stomach hurting. So when I'm thinking your stomach hurts, I'm like, well, why don't you try and go to the bathroom? And he said, I don't have to go to the bathroom, Mommy. I said, okay. Well, the evening progressed and we all went to bed. But about sometime around 1 o'clock in the morning, he comes in my room. He's like, Mommy, my stomach is really hurting. And I noticed he was having difficulty breathing. But what he couldn't articulate to me was that it wasn't a stomach ache. He was having muscular pain from his diaphragm trying so hard to force air into his lungs. So all he knew was that he was cramping, but it wasn't an ache. It was from his muscles trying so hard. So I ended up having to rush him to CHKD. He was having an asthma attack. I didn't know he had asthma, and his was seasonal asthma. So every time when the seasons change from summer to fall and then from winter to spring, he just really has a difficult time because of the seasons, and I didn't know anything about it because I've never had asthma. So that was my first encounter with my own child having an asthma attack. And that particular night, we ended up staying over at CHKD because of all the treatments that he had to receive. And they told me he would probably grow out of it, which he has. And I'm so very thankful for it. But my husband has really bad asthma. And I'll tell you that last December, it was December 20th, because I remember it was TCC's graduation night. And I always have to go as one of the professors. So that evening, my sons had baseball practice that my husband had dropped them off at, and he was supposed to pick them up by a certain time. Well, as I am on my way home from graduation, it had to be about 9:15, 9:30. I turn onto my street, and I noticed that there's a couple of fire trucks and an ambulance, and I'm thinking to myself, oh gosh, I hope whoever it is okay. Not realizing that they were at my house. So anyway, as I pulled up, the paramedic asked me, he said, do you live here? I said, yes. Where are my children? Where's my husband? And he said, we have your husband in the back of the ambulance. And they wouldn't allow me to see him because what had happened was as he was on his way to getting ready to go and pick up the children, he was having difficulty because he had a cold. And he has asthma, and his doctor always told him, if after 3 puffs of your inhaler you have no relief, call 911. So on his way to the car, he had taken the 3 puffs of the inhaler, no relief. Called 911. By the time paramedics reached my house, he was unconscious. And all of this kind of happened at the same time. The paramedics arrived, I came around the corner, and then a parent from baseball practice was bringing the children home. So it really makes me very nervous. And he ended up having to stay a night in the hospital because of the asthma attack that he had. But what he didn't realize, and this is why it's so very important to know medications that you take and know interactions between medicines and what can happen. He had taken Alka-Seltzer Cold Plus for what he thought was a cold, but it had an adverse reaction with his medication, with his asthma medication, and it immediately sent him into. I'm thankful that he didn't go into cardiac arrest, but it sent him into a tremendous asthma attack. So, don't ever take for granted something that you do so easily is easy for everyone. My sister-in-law is a pharmaceutical sales representative, and she kind of helped me understand. I've never performed the activity, but she sells medication to doctors to try to get them to try new products for those who have respiratory issues. And she explained to me that in one of their conferences, when they were trying to get everyone to understand how difficult it can be to breathe during an asthma attack, they gave everyone a straw. Not a regular drinking straw, but a coffee stirrer type straw. And that was the only mechanism that they could use to breathe as they walked vigorously around a room. And basically what they were trying to convey was that this is how difficult it can be for a person suffering from an asthma attack trying to breathe. So they were trying to sell their product and said, and this is how quickly our product could work. So that's my little spiel on the respiratory system. But don't ever take for granted that you can breathe, because it could be such a different way. Okay, into the PowerPoint presentation we go. So first thing you'll notice is that it talks about the breathing mechanism itself. Respiration is the process of you exchanging gases in the atmosphere with the gases that you have inside, and taking whatever is in the atmosphere and pulling out that oxygen that we need in order to breathe. Ventilation, however, means breathing. Okay? So ventilation is actually breathing. Respiration is grabbing the gases in the air, taking what you need, giving off what you don't. So basically, whatever environment you're in, if you're in the hills of West Virginia where the air is crisp and clean, you're going to get all that good oxygen. Or if you're standing in the middle of the expressway in Los Angeles, you're going to get whatever's in that atmosphere as well. So it's just taking whatever's there and getting what you need and getting rid of the carbon dioxide that you don't. So that's why it's so very important for us to save trees and plants, or have plants in your home. I don't know if y'all can see a plant in my house. I've got one, a big one right there. There's another one right there. That tree is not actually real, but you know what I'm trying to say. But the plants need carbon dioxide in order to start their process in which they make their own food, photosynthesis. And actually, after they go through that entire process, they give off oxygen. Well, oxygen is what we need. So the more plants and the more trees that we have, the more oxygen we have in the air. And then we're able to get rid of what we don't need, which is the carbon dioxide. Okay, so first thing that needs to happen is you need to breathe. After you breathe, external respiration. Occurs. And what happens is that's when the gases actually move into your lungs. First thing you got to do is you got to breathe it in. Once you breathe it in, then the organism breathes. I'm taking it all the way back to the levels of organization. The organism breathes, and then the proper organ system goes to work. The organ system would be our respiratory system. From that point, we need to get it specifically to where it needs to go. So external respiration is when those gases move into our lungs. The lungs being the organ. Okay, well, we need to get it all the way down to a cellular level, because we know it's the red blood cells that are responsible for oxygen transport, right? So from the organ, we need to then send it to the tissue for transport. So those gases are then transported to our bloodstream. Blood being the tissue, right? Blood is connective tissue. Remember, there are 4 different types of tissue. 4. Epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. So here we have transported it into the bloodstream, because we know inside of the bloodstream, or inside of the blood, is where we will find those formed elements, the red blood cells. Okay, so from the blood, then we got to get it down to that cellular level, right? Then it's internal respiration that occurs. Internal respiration is when now those gases that we've just taken in move directly to the formed elements. So the formed element specifically would be the red blood cells. So we've gone from the organism breathing, right? The organism breathes. The organ system that goes to work is the respiratory system. The particular organ that is going to help us, obviously, the lungs. Inside of the lungs, we transport it to the blood, because the blood is where we'll find the formed elements. The blood, then we get it directly to what's going to do it, the red blood cells. And then finally, once those red blood cells get a hold of it, cellular respiration occurs. And it's the cellular respiration that occurs where we have the exchange of gases. So whatever gases we took in, we're going to exchange them for what it is that we need, and then we're going to get rid of what we don't. So we take that oxygen, it gets all the way down to the red blood cells, they go and do their thing, and it's like, hey, but you know what? We don't need this carbon dioxide. So what are we going to do? After we exchange the gases, we're going to make everything happen in reverse. And then finally, you'll exhale. From the organism inhaling, all of this goes on, gets all the way down to the cellular level. It's like, got what we need, get rid of what we don't. Exhale. Phenomenal, right? Okay. Let's continue on. In the PowerPoint, you will notice it defines the various organs of the the respiratory system. Some of them we've already looked at in the digestive system, like the pharynx that we know is the throat and the 3 regions of that. So you can revisit that. But we're going to actually identify a few other organs that we haven't talked about so far. Okay, so if you go down to the slide that talks about the upper respiratory tract, have you ever gone to the doctor and they tell you you have an upper respiratory infection and you're trying to figure out, okay, well, where does that start and stop? Actually, anything from the trachea superiorly is considered your, and I said trachea like it's way down here. It actually starts up in here. From the trachea all the way up, that will be considered upper respiratory. Lower respiratory will be anything from the most inferior portion of the trachea down to the bronchial tubes, into the lungs, so on and so forth. So you see the upper respiratory tract there. And once again, if you don't recall from when we were talking, when we were learning the cranial bones and the bones of the skull, please go back and recall the fact that there are what are called sinuses. Sinuses are spaces within the bones. Those spaces are designed to reduce the weight of the skull. And please make sure you know the different bones that have sinuses in them. They are located in the PowerPoint presentation, and we had discussed them before. Just make sure you know where they are. All right, so continuing on, the first organ that we see in the respiratory system is the pharynx. And we know it's the throat. In addition to that, we know it has 3 regions. Nothing is kind of separating them. It's just according to the different anatomical structures that it passes beyond. So the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, laryngopharynx. We already got that one. The larynx, or larynx, as some people call it, is also known as the voice box. Inside of it, we have the vocal cords. Vocal cords are in the respiratory system because the only way that we can produce sound is for air to make those cords vibrate. In the event that something happens to the cords or they become inflamed, we have a condition called laryngitis. They can't vibrate, can't produce sound, you have no voice. Also, you will notice in the slide that says vocal cords, and I think I'm going to draw this as well, because we're looking at it from a superior view. There are 2 terms that you need to know. The glottis and the epiglottis. Okay? I'm going to attempt to make my best diagrammatic representation of the lateral view of the esophagus and the trachea. Here we go. This is the esophagus. Oh, I guess you can't see. That's the esophagus. And that's the rest of the throat. Okay, because we know that the esophagus is the food tube, right? So that's where food is going to go down. But just anterior to the esophagus, and the reason why I'm drawing these rings is because the trachea actually looks like a vacuum cleaner hose, kind of. It's got cartilaginous rings around it. And ideally, when you swallow, and this is the opening to the trachea. Ideally, when you swallow, there's supposed to be a little flap. There is a little flap. This to cover that area so that the food can be shunted down through the esophagus, which is the food tube. That's the way it's supposed to go. The flap that covers the opening the opening is called the glottis. So that would be this area right here, the opening. That would be the glottis. The flap that's to cover the glottis is called the epiglottis. No, Star. I'm sorry. Star. 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 Come here. Come here. Come here. Come here. I am so very sorry. Sit. No. Sit. Come here. No bark. Come here. So the flap that covers the opening. Star. Excuse me. No. Come on. Go on. Okay, I'm back. The flap that covers the opening is the epiglottis, while the glottis is the opening itself. So ideally, every time you swallow, you should have that epiglottis closing off the trachea so nothing goes down there. But we know that sometimes that doesn't happen. Either, I know the other day I was eating something, and I wasn't eating particularly fast, but sometimes this can happen if you're eating too fast. The epiglottis doesn't have an opportunity to cover the glottis, and then something shunts down into your trachea, and then of course you cough or sometimes you'll choke. But I was eating something. What was I eating that day? I know what it was. I was actually eating a salad, and inside of my salad I had jalapenos. I like jalapenos. I love them in my salad. But you know, they've got those little seeds. So as I was trying to put the food in my mouth, sometimes if you just inhale, sometimes very light particles will automatically you can just inhale and it'll go into your mouth. Well, that's what happened with this particular seed. And I immediately began to choke. I was sitting right at my desk, and Mr. Walton was sitting there too, and I just could not get myself together because that seed was hot, and it went down into my trachea, and I continued to cough and cough and cough, and eventually I got myself together. But the epiglottis didn't have an opportunity to cover the glottis to keep that seed, because all I did was, and it immediately shunted right through. So my epiglottis didn't even have an opportunity to cover the glottis. So back to what I was saying. The epiglottis is the flap that covers the opening. The opening is the glottis. All right, continuing on. The next slide you see is the trachea. The trachea is also known as the windpipe. The trachea, like I was telling you, kind of looks like a vacuum cleaner hose. It has cartilaginous rings, and it leads all the way from your throat all the way down to the bronchial tubes. And if you look at the slide, you'll see it. It's just inferior to the larynx, and then the trachea is all the way down until it bifurcates or splits and becomes part of the bronchial tree. Now we need to talk about this bronchial tree. You can see it in the PowerPoint presentation, how it breaks down. But it's really kind of easy to understand. The primary bronchus. Okay, let's say that this is my trachea. Okay, there's the trachea. Where the trachea splits and first moves into the lung, the first split is called primary. So that would be the primary bronchus. You have the right primary, left primary. The right moves into the right lobe of the lung, to the right lung, and then the primary bronchus also moves into the left lobe. So that each lung has a primary bronchus. Well, the primary will then split off to secondary bronchus or bronchi, because there's more than one. The secondary will then split and become tertiary bronchi. And then further, the tertiary will split and become what are called terminal bronchioles. Terminal bronchioles. If you haven't done so already, I did post a worksheet, I believe, on the respiratory system. And it actually shows this as well, so you can outline and diagram that so that can help you understand a little bit further. Or you can look at it in the PowerPoint presentation. Now, you would think primary, secondary, tertiary to terminal. Terminal, you think, okay, terminal means the end. Well, actually, it's not in this case. The terminal bronchioles, however, are so very small that in the PowerPoint presentation, they have to take a little piece of it and enlarge it so that you can understand what's happening. The terminal bronchioles then branch off to what are called respiratory bronchioles. So this is telling you, okay, this is where the actual process of exchanging the gases is getting ready to go. So primary, secondary, tertiary to terminal. Terminal's not the end because that means we're getting ready to move into the respiratory bronchioles where that gas is going to be exchanged. The respiratory bronchioles branch off into what are called alveolar ducts. A duct is a passageway. It's telling you, okay, I'm getting ready to leave you to the site where the real stuff happens. At the end of these respiratory ducts, these alveolar ducts, we have these, what looks like clusters of grapes. This is called an alveolar sac. And each one of these little grapes, so to speak, is called an alveolus. Plural, alveoli. The alveoli are the sites of gas exchange in the respiratory system. And if you look at the PowerPoint presentation where it says alveoli at the top, you will note that there are capillaries that are red and blue that completely surround these alveolar sacs. Reason being, remember how we talked about the fact that capillaries have walls that are so thin that gases can pass right through them? And that's why we need them so badly as far as what we do with embalming, because formaldehyde is a gas and we need the gas to permeate the tissues in order to fixate it. Well, now you can see these alveolar sacs, these alveoli have walls that are so very thin. They will also allow for gases to pass right through. So if you've got all these capillaries that are right there, capillaries have blood in them. Those capillaries will have those red blood cells in them. So if I'm an alveolar sac and I've got these capillaries surrounding me, I can take the gases that I just finished breathing that are sitting in this alveolar sac, and these capillaries are right on top. So all it has to do is allow the gas to pass through the alveolar cluster or the alveolar sac into the capillaries, and the capillaries can say, hey, there's the oxygen that I need. Here, let me give you this carbon dioxide. Get rid of it for me. So they're working in tandem such that the alveolar clusters have the very thin walls, and so do the capillaries. Phenomenal. Okay, the next part that we have, obviously if we're talking about all of this, we got to figure out what this is in. It's inside the lungs. We have two lungs, right, left lung. The right lung has 3 lobes and the left lung has 2. But the left lung also has what's called the cardiac impression. The cardiac impression is where the heart sits. The right lung does not have one. It has a superior lobe, a middle lobe, and an inferior lobe, while the left just has the superior, inferior, and the cardiac impression. Now, if you continue to read through the PowerPoint presentation, and I think it's definitely in the chapter, and make sure you understand that our nose is also a vital part, obviously, of the respiratory system because it helps us breathe. And if our nose is stopped up, then we have to breathe through our mouth. So our mouth is also a part of the respiratory system. But the nose has a specific function. It actually has hair inside of it. And the hair inside of the nose is to help filter the air that we breathe. So if we're someplace and there's a lot of dust, ideally we don't want the dust to be able to get directly into our lungs, because obviously that can lead to other conditions which are called pneumoconiosis, and dust particles can get into your respiratory system. But our nose will filter that air. Not only does it filter it, but it also helps to warm the air that we breathe. So, having said all of that, that has covered both the male and female reproductive system as well as the respiratory system. I hope you have taken notes. I hope you've taken good notes. If you have any questions about anything, please feel free to send me an email. This PowerPoint will be available from now all the way up until your class time, which will be 4:30 on Wednesday. You can access it as many times as you like between now and that time. If you have trouble opening it up, I suggest saving it to maybe your desktop or your USB drive, and then you can open it from that location. Other than that, I think we're good to go. You will take this quiz that will be on the male and female reproductive systems and the respiratory system on Wednesday. Please excuse the dog barking. She was doing really, really well. Didn't know people were going to walk by, and she was going to decide to let them know that she was home. But anyway, I hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend, and I will see everybody on Wednesday. Bye.